Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria and other conversations about race? This is a professional development resource for cross-cultural counseling. This book was written by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Dr. Tatum is a Black woman from Massachusetts who now lives in Atlanta, Georgia. Some of her self-professed identities include being a professor, psychologist, wife, and mother. She is also the former president of the historically Black college, Spelman College. Years of teaching a course called The Psychology of Racism informed this book. My name is Gina Fleck, and I am a young white woman from a rural middle-class town in Pennsylvania. I'm currently studying school counseling at Loyola University. While this is intended to be an anti-racist professional development resource for fellow students and counselors, I want to name the fact that I will never fully understand the experience of being a person of color in the United States. I have done my best here to summarize the most prescient bits of information in the hopes of moving the needle towards racial equity in our country. But I will inevitably fall short, and I am open to critiques when I do. Still, I hope this adds to the conversation. As far as flow of this presentation, we'll discuss overall themes, their application to school counseling, some personal reflections, and additional professional development resources. Overall themes. So what is this book about? At the center of these conversations is an understanding of racial identity, the meaning each of us has constructed or is constructing about what it means to be a white person or a person of color in a race-conscious society. So this text offers a starting point to demystify conversations about race, to better understand the concept of racial identity, and to communicate across racial and ethnic divides. So it is because we live in a racist society that racial identity has as much meaning as it does. We cannot talk meaningfully about racial identity without also talking about racism. First, we need to get on the same page about how we define racism. Is it individual prejudice or something different? A system of advantage based on race. The distinction here is important. Dr. Tatum argues, as I do, that racism is a system of advantage based on race. It is a system that advantages whiteness and disadvantages people of color. Unfortunately, it is baked into the institutions and policies of our nation. This book was first written in 1997 and was rewritten with a 70-page prologue in 2017. That prologue outlines continued disparities between white and Black people and other people of color in the US. All metrics from housing, education, salary, to life expectancy show the ways in which our society still advantages whiteness. A helpful metaphor for understanding racism as something that is cultural and systemic, which Dr. Tatum gives us, is that of inhaling smog in the air. Sometimes the smog is so thick it is visible. Other times it is less apparent, but always day in and day out, we are breathing it in. No individual can live in a polluted society and not breathe in some smog. So the question should not be, is someone a racist? But what can we do to interrupt racism? What can we do, especially as school counselors, to interrupt racism? So let's think about that. For this, I'm going to read a quote from page 91 of the book. Dr. Tatum says, "It is helpful to visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go the same direction as the white supremacists. But unless they are actively walking in the opposite direction, at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. So how do we move more people to active anti-racism? For this, let's dive into racial identity development. Who am I? To answer this, we have to consider the words of social scientist Charles Cooley, who said, "Other people are the mirror in which we see ourselves." So our students are asking themselves, what do I learn from my neighbors, teachers, peers, and the media about who I am? The parts of our identity that capture our attention are those that other people notice and that they reflect back to us. Those parts reflected back are often those things that make us different than the mythical norm in the United States. Someone white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. This norm represents the dominant identity in society, but it is often the targeted identities which hold our attention and the dominant identities that go unnoticed. So this brings us to racial identity development in childhood. You'll see there's a box of chocolate milk on the left because there's a story shared in the book about Dr. Tatum's son, Jonathan, when he was in preschool. He was the only Black kid in his predominantly white preschool in Massachusetts. And another little boy asked him if his skin was brown because he drank too much chocolate milk. It was an observation that is indicative of the development of children of this age. And we know that if we think back to our human development classes, that children are very literal and they start to notice physical differences as early as age 3. And so when Jonathan's classmate was asking him if he drank too much chocolate milk, he was really trying to make sense of the world around him. And in these scenarios, we need to be able and willing and ready to affirm identity and offer explanations for those differences. Unfortunately, when most children comment on physical difference, when they merely discuss the world around them and mention race, they are silenced. Earliest race-related memories are often thought of with emotions of shame and fear and confusion, and they're negative emotions. And those get internalized and they follow us into adulthood, where we continue to believe this idea that race is not something to be talked about. When really, if we think back to this chocolate milk situation, the simple answer is to explain that everyone has different amounts of melanin in their skin, and Jonathan had the most melanin in his skin, which made him happy that he had the most of something in his class. But we need to be educated on this information and willing to share this at the ready, so our kids know that it's important and necessary to continue these conversations about race. Children who have been silenced often enough learn not to talk about race publicly. Their questions don't go away, they just go unasked. So now we're going to move to talking about racial identity in adolescence. And the central question of our book: why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? So we think back to this idea of a mirror reflecting society's ideas back to ourselves about who we are. And racial clustering happens in schools because of society confronting them with racially charged experiences, often racist experiences. And so in response to this, adolescents often develop an oppositional identity, an identity that's different than the dominant one, an identity that embraces and explores their particular racial grouping. And so you'll see this in Black kids sitting together at a cafeteria, in Hispanic kids sitting together at a cafeteria. And this exploration really starts to take place in adolescence, when there are the cognitive and physical abilities to undergo this racial, ethnic, cultural, REC identity development. So oftentimes sitting together in a cafeteria with peers who look like them and who can understand their perspective is a positive coping strategy. When it becomes something other than a positive coping strategy is when the cafeteria table only offers a limited view into what it means to be Black, what it means to be Latinx, what it means to be Asian. And so this is an area where we can come in as school counselors and educators to affirm that identity and to broaden that identity. As far as racial identity development in adulthood goes, this continues to be a time of circular exploration, a time of immersion. So Black adults, people of color, often will choose to move to communities where people look like them. And that way they have a support system. Of course, it makes sense that people want to feel a sense of belonging and want to feel supported. And so that's reflected in the decisions about where they choose to go to college, where they choose to live, where they choose to send their kids to school. But this process of racial identity development is not a linear one. It is definitely one where there is a circular process of questioning and resolution and questioning and resolution and over again. And if we give them the tools in childhood and adolescence to resolve those questions in a positive and affirming way, then they will also continue thriving and resolving those questions in adulthood. So the application to school counseling. The task for each of us, white and of color, is to identify what our own sphere of influence is, however large or small, and to consider how it might be used to interrupt the cycle of racism. And for us, our own sphere of influence, aside from our home communities and our families, is the sphere of school counseling. So let's get to it. Since everything is a microcosm of the larger society, or the school, that is a microcosm of the larger society, there is indeed racism present in the school setting. Schools are still heavily racially segregated, unfortunately, even 20 years after the writing of this first book. They're more segregated than they were in the 90s. But still, in racially mixed schools, in all schools, students continue this narrative of racial difference and feed into stereotypes and bullying of their peers of color. Teachers often question student ability based on racial grouping. So Dr. Tatum gives an example of Malcolm X, who, when he was a student, wanted to pursue, I believe it was law, and his teacher basically said, maybe you should think about a different course of action. Maybe you should think about tech school, trade school, and essentially told him that he wasn't going to be able to become a lawyer. And he internalized that messaging, as many of our students do. There is also the wider administrative policy of upholding tracking policies that advantage white students. This is really troubling because there's even an example of a study that was done in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a school district near Charlotte, North Carolina, where students who took a standardized test, the data was disaggregated into racial groupings, and white students and Black students received scores in the 90th percentile on the standardized test. But those same students, when we look at their placement in AP classes, in honors classes, 70% of white students who scored 90th percentile were in those honors classes, while 20% of Black students who scored in the 90th percentile in that district were placed in honors and AP classes. So we really need to think about this messaging of Black and people of color being intellectuals in this rich history of intellectualism, and how as a school and as administrators and teachers, we are telling our students that they are inferior to their peers academically and intellectually with these tracking policies. As far as enhancing multicultural counseling competencies goes, we definitely need to consider the effect of race on adolescent identity development and understand that it colors everything from dating to issues of anxiety to academic concerns. Everything happens through this lens. So we need to take that into consideration in our counseling spheres. And also remember the importance of broaching race. This makes clear how, this book makes clear how important race is in identity development and in the resolution of challenges and finding strengths. So we need to remember that. With this, we always should operate from a strengths-based perspective and seek to empower, to let students know that we believe in them, that they have gifts and unique abilities. And also to recognize that the locus of the problem, the locus of control, may be external as well as internal, is often external, and is the challenges that arise are often the result of larger systemic problems. So more implications for school counselors. Let's raise resistors. Don't you love this phrase? This is really equipping kids to recognize the wrong that racism and other isms are, teaching them to spot it when they read about it, when they hear about it, and to name it, and to speak up about it when they do. And also to not internalize those negative ideas, but instead to affirm children's identities. So I put some of the books that are recommended for affirming children's identity, and there is a list actually at the end of this PowerPoint that includes something called an Instagram page called Inclusive Storytime, and is also focused on telling children of color that they are beautiful, that they are powerful, adding something other than victimization to the narrative. For white kids, we really need to also encourage them to spot racism and other isms when they see it. And we need to give them examples, concrete examples of white people who have resisted racism in the past. Everyone, regardless of race, needs to feel empowered and able to take on whatever issues come up from their unique racial grouping. More of what we can do. So communicating high standards and demonstrating assurance of a belief and ability. There's this idea that Black students and students of color so rarely hear that they are expected to do well, that they are expected to excel. And so communicating those high standards consistently and demonstrating that assurance is like water on parched land, Dr. Tatum says. They need to hear it, and when they do, it creates this amazing mentality within them. We also need to offer concrete examples of the long tradition of intellectuals of color. One consequence of racial grouping in schools is, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes a narrow definition of what it means to be Black. And we want to expand this definition to include the tradition of intellectualism, and to say that this is not something that's just for white kids, that there's a long line of intellectuals of color, and say that that can be you as well. Also really important, when students inevitably, unfortunately, experience racist remarks, they need to have a safe space to retreat to. And so we can form affinity groups in our schools for students of color. This might seem bizarre when we're trying to desegregate schools, but students need a space to retreat to where other students understand their experiences, and they can really discuss those and use it as a springboard for thriving outside of those groups. In Massachusetts, there was a school district where they implemented this, and it had immediate effects on academics and behavior. And it's not something that would be hard for us to do. It's students are grouped one period a day, and they know that they have that space that they can go to. We also need to be cognizant of bridging the gap between culture of home and the culture of the dominant society. So for our immigrant students, for really any students that are coming from a background that is not the dominant society, we can do things like advocate for bilingual curriculum. We can make sure that people who look like our students are represented in our curriculum. This is really key to making students feel like they belong and not marginalized. Really important is to promote the idea that intelligence is malleable. So this resists stereotype threat and this notion that Black students and students of color are just expected not to do well. We can instead teach the idea that intelligence comes down to thinking we can, working hard, and getting smarter. When this was done in a study of Black students, it was shown that they enjoyed their academic experience much more, and they had significantly higher grades than those who did not receive this info. So this is something that could easily be implemented through SEL lessons. And this shifts a student's focus from the anxiety of proving ability in the face of negative stereotypes to the confidence of improving with effort. Some other ideas are understanding the benefit of immersion experiences for students of color when guiding them towards higher education or work opportunities. understanding how important it is for them to feel belonging. So maybe thinking about an HBCU, there is research to suggest, there's research to prove actually, that students at HBCUs experience higher academic achievement, enjoy greater social involvement, and aspire to higher occupational goals than their peers do at predominantly white institutions. And this just goes along with that idea that students need to feel engaged, connected, accepted, and to feel that support and encouragement. And further, we should advocate for administration to hire teachers with demonstrated experience in working with multiracial populations. We need to think of all backgrounds and recognize that it is white folks who have the chance to access higher education, to, do a year abroad in Europe. Like, we need to stop looking for those things and instead focus on that experience with working with multiracial populations. So there's a lot we can do as school counselors. And now to offer some personal reflections. I'm including some pictures of a recent trip that I made with my partner to Ben's Chili Bowl in DC. This is a Black-owned business, and it's one of the longest running Black-owned businesses in the city of Washington, DC. When I visited, there was a picture of George Floyd, and I started to think about these images that we see of Black people and honestly our Black kids, what they're seeing. And, the last year or so has really been a period of racial reckoning in our country. And it has brought to light all of the ways that we don't live in a post-racist society, and how our kids are just so in need of positive examples, of a positive, affirming examples of themselves. And I'm just grateful for this book because it has given me so many tools for how to address racism in our larger society, but also in my particular sphere of influence, which is in schools. And I think it has given me so many ideas for being an ally and just a remedy to despairing about race relations still being so difficult in this country. It has convinced me that change can happen, and that it needs to happen, and that if it's going to happen, it's not just time, but intention and purpose that is going to make things better. So I'm just grateful that this moved me from a position of despair and anger to one of action and one of confidence in what can be. And I'll just leave everyone with this last quote. Like I said earlier, we can't solve a problem if we can't talk about it. So the greatest single antidote to violence is conversation, speaking our fears, listening to the fears of others, and in that sharing of vulnerabilities, discovering a genesis of hope.